Judge Grayson believed he was sentencing an ignorant youth, until the defendant methodically dismantled the case like a veteran lawyer. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the atmosphere hung dense and nearly choking. Crowds packed the gallery, whispering among themselves as they observed every unfolding moment. The desk assigned to the accused appeared disproportionately grand for the slight figure beside it. With his hands casually tucked away, his chin arched ever so slightly, exuding quiet defiance. 19-year-old Jalen Dawson, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest, faced grave allegations, yet Judge Walter Grayson's piercing gaze made it obvious that his trial was more a spectacle of bias than a battle of legal merits. Judge Grayson reclined in his seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the gleaming surface of his desk. Peering over his glasses, he scrutinized Jalen, a subtle twist forming on his lips, a blend of amusement and disdain. "You reckon you're a legal prodigy?" he scoffed dryly, his tone laced with sardonic humor. "This isn't a debate circle, kid," he mocked, as a ripple of snickers swept across the courtroom, bailiff, stenographer, and even the prosecutor, all sharing a knowing grin. Jalen remained unshaken, not overtaken by laughter. He had honed his skills over years for such moments, albeit not precisely this one. He hadn't envisioned himself on trial, yet he navigated the courtroom as if it were etched into his very skin. While peers memorized basketball stats, he mastered case law. As friends immersed in video games, he rehearsed mock trials in his mind, debating with legal shadows. Denise Dawson, his mother with 2 decades as a paralegal, filled his childhood with tales of crooked prosecutors, biased judges, and apathetic defense lawyers. By 14, he had internalized the intricacies of trials, dissecting legal proceedings with a prowess that rivaled budding law scholars. Yet all his expertise seemed irrelevant to Grayson, who saw Jalen merely as another wayward youth. "Let's expedite this," the judge muttered as he swung open the case dossier. "I've a tea time at 2, he declared, prompting a fresh round of amused chuckles from the gallery. Yet a subtle pivot occurred, a nearly undetectable smirk played on Jalen's lips, signaling that Grayson's error had just been committed, though the courtroom remained oblivious. Mitchell Carrington, the prosecutor, rose from his seat with the assured air of a man already victorious. His suit was impeccably tailored, his tie tied with near-military precision, and his voice resonated with that well-rehearsed, unwavering confidence as if he had delivered this argument 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state intends to demonstrate without any lingering doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was apprehended red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6 reported missing hours prior to his arrest. Officers chased him through the heart of downtown, where he allegedly attempted to escape before capture. His fingerprints were discovered on the steering wheel. The prosecution argues that the evidence speaks for itself." Those words struck heavy, the gallery stirred, murmurs weaving through the assembly. At first glance, it appeared damning, a theft, a high-speed chase. Glancing briefly at Jalen over his spectacles, Judge Grayson then refocused on Carrington as the prosecutor advanced toward the jury box, each step marked by the rhythmic click of his polished shoes. "The defense might argue this is merely a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is simply an unfortunate casualty of circumstance," Carrington declared, finally locking eyes with Jalen. "But honestly, who flees from the police?" The atmosphere grew even more taut with tension. Judge Grayson leaned in, his chin propped thoughtfully on his hand. Jalen remained unflinching. Carrington kept rifling through his neatly stacked documents. "Your Honor, I present the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who distinctly observed the defendant at the wheel just before he made a bid to escape. The vehicle was verified as stolen, and the arrest executed strictly by protocol." Grayson exhaled, nodding slightly. This seemed straightforward, and to most in the room it did. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Yet Jalen, having studied trials for years, saw the cracks and remained silent, watching and waiting. Judge Grayson lightly tapped his gavel, announcing, "Now, let's hear the defense's reply." He then turned to Jalen's attorney, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had spoken scarcely a few words since entering the courtroom. She stood, visibly uneasy. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen interjected, gently placing his hand on her arm as a wordless plea. She faltered, then resumed her seat, and at that moment, Jalen declared, "I shall represent myself, Your Honor." Instantly, an oppressive hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Grayson fixed his gaze upon him with a wry amusement, prompting a puzzled, "You will, what?" From Jalen came a composed, unwavering reply, "I will defend myself." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, the bailiff's eyebrows arched, and Carrington's smirk wavered momentarily before he erupted in a brisk, sharp laugh, remarking, "This ought to be interesting." But laughter died away as Jalen advanced, for the tide was turning. The gravity of the courtroom seemed to encircle him as he shifted his stance. Still with hands in his pockets, he allowed the silence to linger just a moment longer, enough to unsettle them, then declared, "Your Honor, before I proceed, I wish to clarify a point with the prosecution." Carrington arched an eyebrow and folded his arms. "Proceed." Jalen stepped forward deliberately, asking, "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally observed me at the wheel prior to my arrest, correct?" With a sharp exhale of impatience, Carrington replied, "Correct, and that statement is clearly documented in his report. Naturally, it is." Jalen gave a slight nod and then addressed Judge Grayson, "Your Honor, I hereby move to strike that testimony from evidence." Squinting, Grayson inquired, "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen freed his hands from his pockets and motioned toward the prosecution's desk, stating, "Because Officer Ruiz never observed me in that car. In truth, he wasn't even on duty when the pursuit commenced." A brief look of perplexity washed over Carrington's features as he demanded, "What are you saying?" Stepping forward once more, Jalen addressed the court, "Your Honor, if permitted, I request that Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night be examined. If his report claims he saw me in the vehicle, then his location history must corroborate that." Then he paused, letting his challenge linger in the air. "I suspect it won't, now." Murmurs within the gallery swelled in volume. Grayson furrowed his brow, casting a glance toward Carrington. Carrington paused, the brief silence stretching just enough, remarked by the jury, observed by the gallery, and noted most acutely by the judge. Jalen inhaled deeply and quietly, having spent countless years scrutinizing trials and studying every nuance of prosecutors' tactics and system manipulation. He knew one irrefutable truth: a confident Carrington would never dawdle. Carrington then shuffled his documents, his formerly unshakable confidence beginning to fracture, as he asserted, "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, it remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen offered a slight, almost nonchalant shrug. "If the officer was indeed where he claimed, the GPS logs will confirm it, but if he wasn't?" Grayson regarded him intently for a prolonged moment, then addressed Carrington, "Does the prosecution object to verifying the officer's GPS records?" Carrington paused, the brief silence stretching just enough, remarked by the jury, observed by the gallery, and noted most acutely by the judge. Jalen took a quiet breath. Years of watching trials had taught him that every tactic and maneuver mattered. Carrington paused, the brief silence stretching just enough, remarked by the jury, observed by the gallery, and noted most acutely by the judge. Note, the previous line's repetition has been seamlessly integrated into Jalen's measured breathing, underscoring his calculated resolve. Carrington paused, then added after a measured silence, "No objections, Your Honor." Jalen then faced the jury, locking eyes with every member, and asserted, "The prosecution insists that merely finding my fingerprints in a vehicle implies theft. That is the narrative they offer, but let's examine it logically." He inhaled deeply, maintaining a composed, steady tone. Imagine entering a department store and trying on a jacket, slipping your hands into its pockets, perhaps fastening the zipper, then returning it to the rack before leaving. Hours later, if someone is caught shoplifting that very jacket, would your fingerprints on it alone prove you committed theft? Several jurors exchanged knowing glances, while a murmur of discontent drifted from someone in the gallery. Jalen offered no pause for rebuttal. The vehicle in question had been parked outside a 7-Eleven long before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and indeed, as we passed by, I casually leaned against the car. I even opened its door since it was unlocked. I did not commandeer it, nor did I drive or plunder it. It was merely a fleeting moment of idle curiosity, simply a brief lapse of impulsive judgment. Carrington advanced, scrambling for words. "Your Honor, this point is irrelevant. The defendant was apprehended while in possession of the vehicle." Jalen simply shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His tone remained measured, yet it sliced through the courtroom with surgical precision. "I was apprehended several blocks away from where the vehicle lay abandoned, returning home after grabbing snacks with friends. I was neither inside nor near the car, nor fleeing from it. The sole link binding me to this case is the result of poor police work and misguided assumptions." Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, massaging his temple, as it became evident that the case was disintegrating rapidly, and everyone was aware of it. Jalen redirected his gaze to the jury, asserting, "The true culprit evaded capture that night. The officers instead apprehended a black youth from the vicinity, deeming him an acceptable substitute. This is the essence of what this case is truly about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, inquiring, "Does the prosecution have any further statements?" Carrington, visibly rigid and flushed, responded, "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on Jalen for an extended moment before shifting to the jury. Then he leaned forward and declared, "Case dismissed." For a heartbeat, stunned silence prevailed, then chaos ensued. Half the courtroom burst into uproar, some in utter disbelief, others in subdued relief. The gallery stirred as reporters furiously scribbled notes. Jalen paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle and the reality to permeate every mind in the room. Still clutching his gavel, Judge Grayson fixed an inscrutable look upon Jalen. There was a flicker in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, perhaps even remorse. Jalen returned the look, then headed for the exit, yet as he neared the door, the judge called out once more, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen halted, not turning back. Grayson paused briefly before finally remarking, "You should seriously consider law school." A sly smirk played on Jalen's lips. There was no need for contemplation, he was already moving forward. Beyond the courthouse, voices mingled thickly in the air, reporters converged on the steps, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward like sharp weapons. "Jalen, were you aware that the judge would dismiss the case? What will you do next? And how does it feel to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor?" They peppered him. Jalen hoisted his hoodie over his head, dismissing the barrage of questions. He cared not for the spectacle. This was not a contest of wit, but a struggle for something far greater. At the base of the steps, his mother, Denise, stood waiting, her arms crossed and expression inscrutable. For a lingering moment, she simply observed him, then, with a soft shake of her head and a sigh, she murmured, "Boy, you frightened me to no end." Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his head. "I had to take a risk." Mass regarded him a moment longer, then enveloped him in a warm, tight embrace, exclaiming, "You've always been the stubborn one." Cameras continued to flash relentlessly, yet Jalen no longer cared to notice them. Across the street, near his car, Judge Grayson observed intently. His stance had softened, the earlier hubris had vanished, replaced now by an expression not of amusement, but of quiet reflection. He had never anticipated this case to be anything other than routine, merely another day, another defendant, another straightforward guilty plea, but now he realized he would remember it. Jalen had achieved what few could, forcing the system to examine its own flaws, and, for the first time, it hesitated. This teaches us a vital lesson. How many other cases have unfolded in such a manner? How many individuals have been convicted not by incontrovertible evidence, but due to bias, expedient shortcuts, and a system more preoccupied with case closures than uncovering the truth? Jalen possessed the acumen to challenge the system, yet what of those less equipped? This issue transcended a solitary case, it affected them all, and he understood his next course of action. This courtroom would not be his final battleground. Next time, he would not appear as a defendant but as the advocate, and when that day arrived, he would not stand alone. If this account stirred even a moment of reflection in you, let it remind you that while the justice system is founded on laws, it is ultimately administered by fallible human beings, and only through collective scrutiny can it evolve. For next time, it might not be Jalen, it could be someone you know.